A national community is based on two features that do not exist together in any other community. Equality of membership. Of course, you can be equal with the God, but I do not know any religious community that is not hierarchical and distinguished by gender, by age, by knowledge. Every religious community, including Christianity. So what was interesting to me is to see how the reference of Islam as a community giving sense locally was displayed by the building of the nation as this homogeneous group where we are all taking a charge for our destiny independently of God. And that's not because we are imagining, here we like very much political lesson. We are all imagining community, we have one right there. A nation is about a group of people saying we want to decide our fate on our own. And that's why it's so powerful everywhere. That's why this is the only way you can exist internationally today. Try to be a city or an empire, it doesn't work. Even ISIS, it didn't work. So once you said that, you see that the nation state built by the so-called secular ruler use Islam to build this nation community. I will finish and right there. So it meant that to mobilize people, there is no nation. Turkey was created overnight, Pakistan overnight. Actually, in the history of nation building in Muslim land, the secular state comes before the nation. So it meant that a certain number of terms that used to be invested with a traditional meaning or pre-modern meaning are still present, but they have changed meaning, and this meaning has been taught transmit a socialized citizen with this meaning. Ummah is the community of Muslim believers. That's the pan-Islamist modern definition of Ummah. Pre-nation, I finished soon. Pre-nation, I am a Greek Orthodox, I am a member of the Ummah in the Caliph. That is not the definition of ISIS, because ISIS operates on this notion that the Muslim community takes its own fate in hand, which is a Rashid Rida Afghani approach, fighting against the model of the nation based on ethnicity. Sharia becomes state law. Sharia was never state law. Sharia was a monopoly of the ulema regulating local community. Maslaha, everybody say it's public interest. Yes, today, because the state has taken endorsed. Maslaha means the common good of the community. And this community in pre-modern or pre-national communities is plural. There are Muslim and non-Muslim in the Maslaha community. All this is gone. So the nation state will build a new political culture in which being the citizen and being a Muslim is connected together in a way that didn't exist in the pre-national Muslim empire. And the state is the defender, guardian of this connection. So Islamism as a political movement never challenged that because it's a given. Look at Turkey. Turkey is still a secular state, but Atatürk did the job. I'm going to finish on that. Atatürk did the job. He nationalized the Sunni institution, created the and this was not an Ottoman legacy. At the same time, he pushed away Islam from public sphere. But this idea, I am Turkish and I am a Sunni Muslim, that's why many Kurds do not have gold status, not because of Kemal Atatürk. Same thing, you can do this all over the Muslim world. I have done it. The only country that didn't create this hegemonic Islam are Indonesia, Senegal, and Lebanon. And I would say Tunisia was on the way out of that until the coup, which was very fascinating to me in the sense of repositioning the state vis-a-vis the diversity. Even if 99% of people are Muslim in Tunisia, it doesn't matter. There was this intention that I didn't see in any other country of the Arab Spring to reposition the state, to not make it the only actor in defining what is right and wrong in Islam. So, sorry. So what does it mean concretely? Because you can say, oh, this is ivory tower kind of thing, but the reality is, I have patterns that they work. You can take me at face value, but I will get discussed. It's written. You have to. You cannot discuss political Islam if you don't locate it in the political culture of the country in which it's operating. So it's not that Islam is incompatible with democracy. It is what is the political culture that allows a religiously based political movement to evolve toward democracy. It's a different question. We need to stay away from politics being only the monopoly of the state. And that's why also the evolution of Anushi is fascinating. It talks about civility. That is eminently political. It doesn't mean you need the Islamic Party to be at the head of the state. It's really returning to police. And that's why the question of dignity, social justice is important. Islamic Party lose credibility when they enter the partisan game and the state game. They regain credibility when they talk to the maslahat of people. And in this sense, it's never dead. It's not going to be dying for a long time. And the Arab barometer was fascinated by the result. It's exactly what people are saying. We want social justice, we want equality. And the one that had provided this narrative are not the secular ruler, this has been the Islamist actor. And in this sense, they stay away from the state, there's still a lot of hope there. And I stop here if I get longer.
Next speaker is Dr. Marks, who is Assistant Professor of Arab Cultural Studies at NYU Abu Dhabi. And Monica, when you say in conclusion. What the fuck? Yeah, sorry. All right. Can everybody hear me okay? If I speak to you from here? All right, well, I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'll just be lazy and relaxed. And Dalia, you could just throw your hand up when I have, like, let's say, like 2 or 3 more minutes. Awesome, thanks. All right, so today I'm focusing on Ennahda's time in power, its brief time near the helm of government. I imagine everybody in this room knows what Ennahda is. Ennahda, whose name means the Renaissance in Arabic, is the main so-called Islamist party in Tunisia. And those of you who talked to me about this topic before, or who have read or listened to me talking about it, know that I never call Ennahda an Islamist party without problematizing that word, just as I never call someone like Sisi in Egypt a secular autocrat. I'll get more into this as I go, but these words, secular and Islamist, often contain a lot more than they clarify. Now, Ennahda, even though it's been institutionally separate from the Ikhwan, i.e. the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, since its birth in the early 1970s, it's often seen as the local franchise, like your local chain of the Ikhwani McDonald's, the local franchise of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, but it's not. I want to start by separating some evidence-based versus non-evidence-based, some intelligent versus some unintelligent criticisms of Ennahda that you'll commonly hear, even still today. Then I'm going to talk about what Ennahda got right versus at the risk of sounding victim blaming, because Anatha very much is the victim right now. And I don't want to sound like that, but I do want to have an honest analytical discussion about what Anatha got right versus wrong. And then lastly, some lessons to take from this entire experience. So let's get started. Evidence versus non-evidence-based criticisms of Anatha. Anatha has been existing in a pool of disinformation since the 2011 revolution. For decades before 2011, under the prior dictators in Tunisia, Bourguiba and Ben Ali, there was tons and tons of propaganda and misinformation about Anatha that sought to portray Anatha as a terrorist actor, as a violent extremist Islamist actor, rather than as what it was, which was a peaceful, center-right conservative party that just wanted to compete for free and fair elections. Why did Bourguiba and Ben Ali do all that disinformation? Well, because Anatha was the most politically threatening actor and they wanted to demonize it. So even today, you'll hear common criticisms of Anatha from the Tunisian left and from a lot of civil society type people that we would all in this group interface with if we were working on an ethics in Tunisia, or we were working with Tunisian society. You'll still hear from corners of this world, and in fact, the most influential quarters of this Tunisian world that interface most regularly with Western actors from the World Bank and IMF to the US Embassy and others, the following criticisms, which are not evidence-based. You'll hear them say that Anatha facilitated jihadists fighting in Syria between 2012 and 2014 when Anatha was leading the government with two other parties and so you'll hear they supported jihad. No evidence for this, but you'll still hear it. You'll also hear that Anatha was behind somehow the assassinations of Shukri Ben Aid and Mohammed Rahmi in the year 2013. Again, there's no evidence for that, but you'll still hear the criticism a lot. You'll also hear a lot of Tunisians say that Anatha was engaged in wild kinds of corruption, the likes of which other Tunisian politicians were not. Again, no evidence for that. And a fourth criticism that you'll hear a lot of Anatha is that they didn't do enough for security sector, especially between 2012 and 2014, when they were at the helm with the revolutionary Troika, these two secular parties coalition government. Now, I think that for criticism, there's some truth to it, but to imagine that Anatha was going to be the tip of the spear for security sector reform in Tunisia at that time period is contextually unaware. It's as if you would imagine that Black Lives Matter, let's say they got the governorship of New York, that if it's going to be Black Lives Matter that leads police reform. In other words, you're expecting the victim to be the main reformist, the whole perpetrator accountable. And we know from the comparative study of democratization and post-authoritarian situations that often the victims will be ideologically suspect because of decades, years of disinformation. We also know that the victims are not well respected often amongst the security sector. These are not people who, when they come to power, find a usable bureaucracy very easily. And the example I always give there is Ali Laraya, one of the most powerful people in Anatha, had been tortured. He'd been raped. His wife had been subject to horrific abuse. He had been held in solitary confinement for nearly 16 years in the basement of the Ministry of Interior. And after Tunisia's first free and fair election, who becomes the first Minister of Interior? It's Ali Laraya. Now, that was an amazing moment to watch Mr. Laraya stride into the Ministry of Interior. Emotionally inspiring, incredible. But what do the people who work inside that building think of Ali Laraya? They've been taught to see them for decades as scum, as a rat, as something subhuman. So there was a real question about whether or not it really had useful bureaucracy to make these sorts of changes. So those four criticisms that I just detailed, most of which imply that Anatha supported terrorism, or that it was more corrupt than other parties in Tunisia, or that it had the ability to make security sector reform a reality and just didn't do it because of whatever reason. Those criticisms are not evidence-based. There are criticisms, there's another set that I would say are more evidence-based. That Anatha's leadership became increasingly calcified and unresponsive over the years. That Ghannouchi started to threaten internal democracy inside Anatha in some ways, that it became less welcoming for young people and critical voices. I think that there are there is some evidence to those criticisms. But often it's the people who know Anatha the best, it's people who were in Anatha and defected, or who are still in Anatha, that you'll hear those criticisms from people who don't know enough, though. You'll often hear a lot of that disinformation that I've discussed still, and it's still very politically potent. So what did Anatha get right versus wrong? I think Anatha got a lot of things right. In fact, Anatha got so many things right that now a lot of scholars and cousin-like Islamists in the rest of the MENA region are looking at what happened in Tunisia and saying, well, if Anatha gave away the whole house like this, and their leaders are still in prison again, possibly being tortured again after all of this, there's absolutely nothing that we can do right. So screw this. I'm hearing a lot of that from the so-called Islamist right in the MENA region more broadly. But I don't think that Anatha lost or that Tunisian democracy got obliterated because Anatha was not Islamist enough. And I do not think that Anatha lost that Tunisian democracy got obliterated because it was too Islamist. In fact, Anatha did a lot of right things and wrong things, neither one of which were really related to Islam all that much. The right things Anatha did, Anatha had, at least until 2016, until the most recent party congress, Anatha had much more internal democracy than any other political party in Tunisia. And that contrasts just wildly from, let's say, Turkey. Turkey was often held up as a model for Muslim Democrats, but if you look at the internal elections for Erdogan inside the ruling party, AKP, he never won with anything less than 96%. No political party in Turkey, AKP included, has been Democratic. Anatha has been quite a different world. Has Anatha's internal democracy been perfect? Absolutely not. Like I said, especially since 2016, it's become more unresponsive and more calcified. But there was internal balances inside Anatha. There was real competition for who the next leader would be. At the 2016 Congress, it was not at all clear that Tanoushi was going to win re-election as the next leader. So I think that was a bonus that allowed Anatha's leaders to make a lot of compromises whilst keeping most of the party on board. That was what my PhD was about at Oxford, an internal ethnography of Anatha since the revolution. They really did some amazing things. 2 more minutes? Okay, great. They also made a lot of compromises, not just on the fact of the Islamist issues like Sharia and blasphemy that we've all heard about, but on more important political issues like lustration. They almost voted a lustration law in Tunisia that would stop the old regime people from contesting the second round of Tunisia, the second pre-fair elections in Tunisia in 2014, and not voted against that. Those were big wins that allowed the transition to be preserved. However, where Anatha started to stumble more was in making this pivot between the giveaways and the compromise that it needed to do to help Tunisia's democracy survive in its first stage, 2011, 2015, 2016, and pivoting towards making the kinds of reforms needed to help Tunisia's democracy survive in the second stage, let's say since 2015 to 2016. For example, throwing its full weight behind the creation of a judiciary, consolidating Tunisian judicial branch, creating a Supreme Court, and Anatha didn't do that. Anatha didn't focus enough on an economic reform program. They lost sight of their vision for Tunisia, and to a lot of average Tunisians, it started to look more like Sheikh Rashid, like Tanoushi, wanted to simply maintain his seat, and the other leaders wanted to maintain their seat without providing a mobilizing vision. So just a couple lessons, I'll just name these without describing them to take away. Islamism in Tunisia does not equal Anatha. I think we should all be very careful before we call Anatha an Islamist party. Nobody should be calling CSID secular. CSID is way more Islamist in rhetoric and policy than Anatha. And if you look at polling in Tunisia shows that more Tunisians than ever, including young people, are now supporting quote-unquote political Islam in terms of policy. CSID is much more Islamist in terms of rhetoric and policy. So don't conflate these things necessarily. Whenever you hear the words Islamist, secularist, etc. in Tunisia, be very critical. Secondly, propaganda dies hard. Anatha dealt with decades of propaganda and it's coming back to haunt them. I think Anatha lost not because of Islamism, because it was too much or too little Islamist, but because it was the most visible figurehead and the most convenient whipping boy when things went south in Tunisia, economically and otherwise. Reforming the judiciary is very important. Not having a consolidated judiciary branch really mattered. And the fact that Anatha ruled during the period where you had the most jihadist attacks, that was very unfortunate. When people feel afraid for their security, like when there's jihadist attacks, they'll often vote for very anti-democratic despotism, and you need a judiciary to counteract that. wasn't one of Tunisia. So you had a lot of security sector draconian that only continued until today. And then just lastly, I'll say we need to move beyond the secularist framework to understand what's happening in Tunisia and the region more broadly. From 2011 to 2014, when there really were some amazing transitional windows that we could have taken advantage of, almost all of my time talking to US or EU decision makers was eaten up by their obsession with Islamism. What does Islam really mean? What is Islam's real agenda? This whole obsession with the Islamist secular debate shaped a huge amount of the coverage and a huge amount of the intellectual bandwidth for DC and beyond. We weren't thinking about corruption, we weren't thinking about. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Dr. Marsh, professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst.
Thank you, Dahlia. Thank you, everyone. Nice to see everyone again after a few years. The title of this panel is Political Islam, a 45-year retrospective. And historically speaking, one of the most remarkable events in the past 45 years of the history of political Islam is this turn to quote-unquote Muslim democracy. As Monica said, this is something that was talked about in the early years of the AKP in Turkey in the early 2000s, when AKP was a democratizing force with political ruling power. But of course, we see that this is one of the most significant events during the 10-year Tunisian democratic interlude, when in 2016, Ennahda declared itself formally to have quote-unquote left political Islam and entered into something called Muslim democracy. As I mentioned a second ago, many intellectuals within the sphere of the AKP in the early 2000s referred to themselves in this way. We are not Islamists, we are Muslim Democrats. Other scholars and commentators have applied this moniker or this label to other parties and movements in places like Pakistan, Indonesia, Bangladesh, possibly Morocco, and Jordan. And so there's a question here, a very simple question. If Muslim democracy is a term, what is it a turn from and what is it a turn to? Now, there's two very, very obvious ways of asking this question or forms of analysis. The first is to ask, what is this in terms of a political structural analysis? What does it mean for parties and movements and actors to identify themselves in this way or to act in a particular kind of way? So what is Muslim democracy as an empirical, on the ground kind of description of political behavior? And the other is to ask what it means from an ideological, doctrinal, or meaning-based standpoint. So very quickly, in terms of a kind of political structural analysis, I think we're going to want to distinguish between movements, actors, groups, thinkers that are either calling themselves Muslim Democrats or others are calling them Muslim Democrats in semi-authoritarian, semi-democratic regimes like Morocco, Jordan, and again, perhaps Turkey in the early 2000s, when you see a transition away from military rule, a judiciary that is hostile to democracy, so on and so forth. Distinguish that from action within fully democratic regimes. And here, Tunisia, possibly Pakistan, but Tunisia may be the only case in which you have a political movement referring to itself as Muslim Democrats that is able to operate in a democratic context. So what should we think about this sort of turn from within that standpoint? One way of looking at this, most obviously, is that it's simply kind of rebranding. It's simply a way of saying, think about us in a particular way as opposed to another kind of way for the purpose of electoral competition, for the purpose of, as Monica said, the relationship with influential actors outside of the country or outside of the region. But it can also be understood in sort of political science terms as a kind of signaling or a commitment to device to other parties. So it is part of a way of signaling your commitment to the kind of political system that you're constructing democratically, and that you're not holding behind some kind of aspiration to hegemony or controlling the entire political system. It signals a kind of move from a counter-regime politics, potentially revolutionary, even if it's peaceful, even if it's purely political, to an internal regime politics. It's sort of saying political Islam, with apologies to Jocelyn, political Islam has a kind of set of parties or political movements that sees itself as fundamentally opposed to the existing regime, even if it's not violent, even if it's not trying to overturn it through armed force, to a kind of a political movement that sees itself as internal to a regime or a constitutional order. All of that is fairly clear. I think all of that is very much consistent with what Monica was saying, which is that don't really see Ennahda as an Islamist party in any significant way. It doesn't explain their coalition practices. It doesn't explain necessarily their policies, the kinds of things they do when they're in power. It doesn't even necessarily explain the way they campaign for power during. All right, so that is all fairly sort of straightforward. But what does it mean if you're interested in political Islam, again, over this 45 or perhaps 70, 90-year period as political Islam or Islamism as a distinct kind of political ideology, political ontology, political vision about the world. And so again, I want to pose the question, what is Muslim democracy a turn from? And here, just very schematically, I do want to identify the idea that traditionally Islamism is an ideological movement that is characterized by possession of a grand idea. It is impossible to understand the political movements of Islamist parties, the intellectual, the doctrinal formation, the socialization, the kinds of things that were being written and being read, without acknowledging that there is this grand aspiration to an alternative, an ideological, intellectual, moral, spiritual, epistemological alternative to secularism, nationalism, and to authoritarianism. So it first has to be acknowledged that Islamism makes no sense unless you acknowledge historically the ideological aspiration and ambition that it represented. But secondly, and I want to be a little bit more precise here, what I believe that Islamism was characterized by, both in its anti-democratic and in its pro-democratic forms, is something that I call the sovereigntist imaginary. So we all know that traditionally thinkers like Maududi or Sayyid Qutb identify the core idea of Islam as a commitment to divine sovereignty. But as we see it turn towards democratic Islamism, particularly in the writings of Sheikh Rashid, you see also this emphasis on the concept of sovereignty. God is sovereign, but so is the people. The people is also sovereign. Now, the important thing here is that this is not only an anti-democratic move. It's not only to say the military is not sovereign, the king is not sovereign, Bin Ali is not sovereign, the people is sovereign. But it's also a move that emphasizes, when you read it carefully, when you take it seriously, that a particular kind of people is sovereign. Why can both God and the people be sovereign? Because the people has certain kinds of qualities. The people is a believing people. It is a virtuous people. It is a moral people. It is a people that is morally united around the commitment to Islam. That's what I mean by the sovereigntist imaginary. You can imagine politics being organized around a concept like CSID al-Ummah, because the Ummah is perceived as having a certain kind of moral unity. So now, what is Muslim democracy a turn to? So if it's a turn away from those things, it's a little bit less clear what it's a turn to. Not about Islamist rule over the state. It's not about imposing Sharia. It's not about single party rule or domination. What I think when you read carefully certain kinds of statements, particularly by somebody like Sheikh Rashid about what is the meaning of our understanding of the 2014 Constitution. Why do we accept what is more or less a secular democratic order? You have a number of certain kinds of very relatively deep considerations about the question of freedom. So, like I should also mention, there's also sort of pitch here that there's a volume coming out later at the end of the summer by Sheikh Rashid and myself called On Muslim Democracy, which is a collection of 10 of his, I think, most important essays, and then a series of dialogues between him and myself, attempting to identify what is this turn to Muslim democracy. So a lot of what I'm saying here is drawing from that. And so what I argue is that an important thing is a historical reckoning with the concept of freedom, and not just the positive concept of freedom that you see in traditional Islamism. Freedom is Islam. Freedom is the Sharia. Freedom is being governed by God's law. It is that, but there's also a historical reckoning with ordinary negative freedom. Freedom from coercion, freedom of choice, freedom to affirm this or affirm that, and the conception of political freedoms, to organize politically, to be independent from the state, to have organizations of civil society. Second, there is an acceptance of actually existing political pluralism, not an ideal political pluralism. That is, well, of course we have the people of the book. Of course we have people that we recognize as non-Muslim. There's a recognition of actually existing pluralism. There are Bourguibists, there are communists, there are the trade unionists, there are the people that hate us. They are part of the political community, not some ideal conception of what Islam or the Ummah recognizes as reasonable pluralism. Third, there's an understanding that politics is a kind of negotiated contract around shared worldly goods. It is not about the application of an ethical order that precedes politics and is derived from revelation. And then finally, the grand kind of legitimating a discourse around this is a move from kind of theological concepts like the sovereignty of God or the people, the Ummah as God's Khalifa on earth. And there's this increasing emphasis to the foundational exemplary force of the Prophet's covenant of Medina, the Sahibat al-Medina. This is the single most consistent claim that the Prophet formed a political community in Medina that was pluralistic. It was not based on everybody being Muslim. It was a political contract that granted citizenship without regard to theological or creedal agreement. And if that was good enough for the Prophet, it's good enough for us. All right, so just to conclude for real, what is this all a turn to? So what is, in a great kind of 45-year retrospective, how should we understand the ideological significance of the idea of Muslim democracy? And I want to give two simple ideas. One, it is post-sovereigntist. It is not obsessed with the conception of sovereignty, neither God's nor the people's. And that's a major term because throughout the 20th century, the central concept was sovereignty. God's and the people's, the ummahs, and how to reconcile them. The turn to Muslim democracy does not begin with this question, who's sovereign? Where is sovereignty located? And what follows from that? But unlike a lot of the popular discourse, it's not just about these cliches like moderation or not being anti-democratic or authoritarian or something like that. There still is a distinct vision of politics. It begins with the fact of politics as a core fact of political life, in which politics is characterized by conflict, disagreement, but also the most important goods of the world: stability, security, maslaha, economic stability, freedom, all kinds of things. And so the idea is that the world does not begin with revelation, and then we apply that to politics. We are always found in this kind of political moment, but it does not mean that there is a commitment to giving up ideological or religious goals. And so my argument is that Muslim democracy represents post-sovereigntist, agonistic political Islam. It leaves aside this ideological obsession with sovereignty. It accepts democracy on realistic grounds, on realpolitik grounds, but it sees politics as nonetheless a space not where you necessarily give up all of your ideological objectives because you have to be moderate or you have to be secular, but sees politics as the place to pursue them rather than some kind of pre-political ideological commitment. So now we're in this place where we have this idea, but where does it exist in practice? Okay, perhaps still in Turkey, perhaps that's a way of understanding Erdogan for all of his authoritarian tendencies. But with the destruction of democracy in Tunisia, I think we're forced to ask this question: is there a future for this aspiration of Muslim democracy, or again, like Monica was saying, is the death of democracy in Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, other places a sign to, as Monica called them, right Islamists, to completely go back to the drawing board and say, well, what is it exactly that we see as the foundational orienting ideological commitment of politics? Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor Dina Abdul-Qadir. Dina is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts Lowell and Director of Peace and Conflict Studies. Just have to switch to that.
So that there are some in this situation, policymakers confirmed. This is what my area to be shared for the rest of the issues will be. Already the switch issue.
Thank you, CSID, for inviting me to speak today. I have known Dr. Lagwan since 2003. I remember that the first mission with CSID was in Khartoum, Sudan. And upon arrival, we were shocked to know that Turabi was in jail. And so a lot of the people who were coming to the conference unfortunately left and did not attend. My talk today is general, a lot more general than my colleagues. I will talk basically about the challenges that Islamic parties and any really political opposition comes up against. So basically, let me begin today's presentation by saying that not only is there contestation about defining the Middle East as a region, but also the definition of democracy as this panel started, and what democratic transition entails is also contentious. But let us assume that we agree roughly on the regional definition and focus, therefore, on democratic transition. A major detractor from forming a common theoretical agenda for democratization is the fact that the political and divergence. And that divergence has eased our balkanization into different methodological camps. As one of the famous democracy theorists, Robert Dahl, says, talks about polyarchy, which has limited convergence of theorists utilizing procedural democracy from other theorists who work with participatory democracy. That is to say that theorists who are more focused on the informal, non-institutional forms of democratic expression. Thirdly, the political history of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East is comparatively underfocused. Therefore, expanding into non-Western regions is obviously needed. Fourth, thin theory, and I will explain what thin theory is. It is basically data that is quantifiable in order to generalize the findings at the expense of specificity and relevance. Does not capture, for example, in other Arab countries, social movements very limited and weak formal organizations, which brings to another issue with comparative democratization, and that is the analysis of informal networks and innovative repertoires to mobilize that are not accounted for. An example of that is post the Egyptian Revolution. The April 6th movement was invited to MIT to talk about how they organized. And they basically, the members said that they pretended to call on their cell phones when they're in public transportation, whether they're in taxi cabs or the metro. They picked up their phone, not having anybody else on the other side, and said, you know, we're meeting in downtown Egypt on such and such a date at such and such an hour. No, there are no studies that take recognition of this informal way of organizing. And this is one of the theoretical problems. Given that social movements and civil society organizations are oppressed and restricted with varying degrees in the region, and that they lack major political openings, it is particularly interesting to observe and analyze how those societies operate through those restricted spaces to aspire and demonstrate for political rights. I'm in total disagreement with cultural exceptionalism as an explanation of social mobilization in the Arab Spring in general, or in the Muslim world more broadly. That is to say, I take context as a central factor in understanding how informal networks in the Middle East and North Africa operate and how actors among them calculate their actions. The implication that Japan and the Middle East and North Africa may share comparable forms of local does not mean there is an essential East-West divide or other matters. It is an understanding that the West may not be as rational and instrumentalist as many have imagined it to be. Second, theoretically, most modeling in comparative politics and political science as a whole is built on the global north, and therefore southern regions become the outliers in what is assumed to be the norm politically. What comparative democratization needs is the realization that regional cases also could contribute to the classical questions of social mobilization and democratic transition. That is to say, the global south also needs to theoretically be included in our studies of all things political. Contemporary politics are full of examples that currently prove that the universality of certain political concepts is challenged every day. It is time then to be inclusive of those experiences to enrich our thin theories and recognize that comparative politics or democratic transition is not naturally defined. Third, and nation and even Islam, like my colleague Jocelyn said, are inherently problematic and should always be contextualized. Generalization then, or grand theory, becomes hazardous in capturing highly contested definitions such as Islam, democracy, modernity, etc. Specialists of the Middle East region are facing what I call a paradigmatic and methodological crisis. Transition theories and post-transition theories have a striking incapacity to theorize the role of local cultures, historical contexts, and national interest groups. So this is a set of problems. A second set of problems is what I call the national level obstacles. And the first that I'm going to address here is the military's role in democratic transition. The military is one of the oldest and strongest institutions in the political arena, yet it is forgotten in many ways as the pivotal cause for change from above by most of the literature, especially in democratic transition literature. Explaining the variation in the responses of militaries to the outbreak of protests, therefore, is vital to understanding the overall course of the Arab uprisings. It is also important to note that with the little attention paid to the institution and the fact that the institution itself burrowed with different degrees of the Arab world, it also became highly secretive to the detriment of researchers trying to gain accurate information about the military. As an institution, the military in Egypt has exhibited power and economic existentialism. The military as a political player is also involved in regional politics as well as politics with the United States. So we talk about power, and as observed in a lot of the literature about the Egyptian revolution, the army's hold on power is so relentless that even Mubarak had to establish a strong police force in his attempt to hand over power to his civilians, Gamal Mubarak. Although Mubarak was part of the military, but his attempt to switch power to a civilian candidate existentially threatened the military's power, and therefore the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, SCAF, assumed control over the country on February 10th, and the next day persuaded the reluctant Mubarak to resign. Economically speaking, the sort of linchpin or causal factor that affects existential conflict and the result that to the Egyptian military are economic interests. The military's economic involvement is so entrenched that no political force that could stop them. There is no political force that could stop them. Since 2011, the armed forces have increasingly taken on the biggest infrastructure projects, as is evident just this past week with the removal of holy burial sites and spaces to build more. On the domestic level is, sorry for the mistake, antagonistic secularism. Although Western liberalism is partially built on the acceptance and respect of others, the observance of pluralism and the protection of both, liberalism in Egypt pre and post the 2011 revolution, and I would say this is very generalizing, whether we talk about Tunisia or Turkey, for example, that they antagonistically reject and refuse to coexist with what it views as its main rival, Islamically oriented politics and conscience. Quintessential liberalism is defined by the rejection of a privileged class, religion, or national origin. However, secularists in Egypt have basically argued and acted on their assumption that they are privileged holders of the truth politically, socially, and economically. Historically speaking, the liberals in Egypt have copied the Orientalist discourse. What distinguishes those secularists was that they uncritically replicated European anti-Arabism and the debasement of the Arabo-Islamic culture. Their liberalism was non-inclusive of the masses, which is still true today in the aftermath of the 2011 Egyptian revolution. The secular liberal reformers who emphasized rationality and individualism were paradoxically trapped in the cultural order of the other, and therefore could not provide an inclusive notion of national identity and an emancipating notion of political community. The last of the problems and issues here is the entanglement of domestic and international obstacles, specifically US-Egyptian military relations. In March 2014, General Lloyd Austin III, who was the commander of the US command, called Egypt an anchor state. In other words, Egypt is too important to let go, no matter what happens inside. The best proof of this statement is in the numbers. In 2012, more than 2,000 US military aircraft flew in Egyptian airspace. Up to 45 US Fifth Fleet naval ships passed through the Suez Canal annually. Cutting aid would push Egypt into the hands of anti-Western groups, and neither the United States nor the state of Israel can afford that. This is what he said. When the revolution took place, the United States was hesitant to withdraw support from Mubarak. And although the crackdown on the revolutionaries was brutal, bloody, and internationally televised, it took the United States and Europe a while before they timidly supported the revolution. It was out of international embarrassment and not due to real politic calculations that the United States succumbed to the interests of a whole nation. Arms sales and financial aid still continue today without interference, although it is no secret that the regime has caused an unsurpassed amount of bloodshed and incredible human rights violations. In hindsight, the United States position never changed, because although the Arab world received a disproportionate amount of US funding to promote democracy, it received virtually no support to enhance civilian control of the militaries. The one study of Arab civil-military relations, financed before the Arab Spring by the United States Agency for International Development, noted that politically important role of Arab militaries in their absorption of record shares in public budgets, but it questioned, quote, and this is really important because it ties in with a lot of what has been said in other panels, the rightness of many countries in the region for major programs in civil military relations. This is very similar to colonial policies justifying occupation because the indigenous peoples were not ready to rule themselves. So first, the military in Egypt, as in many Middle Eastern countries, has total control of power. Power sharing by civilian institutions or a balance of power between the military and civilian institutions is unheard of. This balance has come about in other transitions, especially in Latin America, through the United States interference. The United States Department of Defense Center for Civil-Military Relations has played a vital role in raising political consciousness and providing necessary information for effective civilian control of the armed forces. Second, the military is highly suspicious of civilian involvement in the economy, and their expertise does not go beyond domestic production and sales of services. However, what is needed for an economy to survive is to be able to navigate basically a global economy. Concluding, sorry. In conclusion, I would like to highlight 2 points. First, theoretically, the field is going through an identity crisis, whether we talk about comparative politics as well as comparative democratization. It is being forcefully pigeonholed to build brand theory, which by definition is opposed to cultural and historical context and nuances. Secondly, also analysts are not linking the domestic level of analysis to the international level of analysis. Thirdly, there is a negligible amount of literature on the agency of political actors in the Arab Spring, which is linked to a bias in the literature, namely the divide between what is rational versus irrational, secular versus religious. Second, the arguments used by the secularists in the 20s and the 30s have not changed a bit. The Egyptian liberals hold that in a culturally backward society, the masses do not have the capacity to make meaningful choices. So it is very dangerous to obliterate one side of the population, especially the majority, from political participation and discourse. Social movement theories indicate that change can occur from above or from below. If one does a comparative study of the region, Egypt in particular, historically has been resistant to change from above. Whether one takes Qasim Amin or Sha'rawi as feminists, or Nazism as a National Socialist experiment, neither feminism from above nor socialist Nazism gained traction as ideas that mobilized the masses. In examining the history of the Muslim Brotherhood as a social movement, they, on the other hand, gained traction as a movement, and their ideas were popularized because they addressed the real needs of the people: free healthcare, free education, free transportation, etc. The underscoring of social justice lies at the heart of this great divide, because as my presentation has illustrated, the divide between the elites, elite interest groups and the masses is complex. This divide is also based on the kind of education they receive. So the power vacuums, coming back to the United States, power vacuums and destabilization are dangerous weapons, as we have known in terms of our foreign policy, through the examples of Afghanistan and Iraq. But to put it, all those factors, basically, the 3 levels of analysis that I've been discussing, the theoretical, the domestic, national, and the international factors, all have to click in the right direction. They are like cogs of a machine. If they are not all aligned right, democratic transition becomes an impossible. And if we compare that to the United States or Great Britain, when they were seeking to democratize their societies, although this laundry list of challenges was not totally 100%. So for any society to democratize today in the developing world, as well as the MENA region, it is very difficult, a difficult goal to attain. Thank you.
Scholar, Hara, doctoral candidate at the Department of Politics at University.
Here, you can start with a couple of things, premises, and then I'll explain what I do. I gather that the description of what I'm doing didn't even make it to the program. The short version of it is I'm going to be, the title of my talk, which you saw in some versions of it, is Tunisia Still Survives. I'll explain where that came from, but it's my Jeffersonian prism on Tunisia's struggle for democracy. I'll explain where that came from in just a moment. But let's make sure I get this right. Okay, the first image is of my mentor, who many of you knew, Professor Rudy Ramazani, who taught at the University of Virginia since the early 1950s. Himself had fled from, he had been targeted for death by the Tudeh party in Iran when he fled, and he was one of those people who found great satisfaction and joy teaching at Mr. Jefferson's University, a place that he dedicated several of his books, his great books on Iranian foreign policy. He did 2 books on Jefferson and struggles for freedom around the world as well, but he was very proud of serving at Jefferson's University. Okay, this next image, which is a little bit dim. Are you hearing me okay? Okay. Okay, good. That's an image of me doing my, a little lighthearted here. It's the end of a long day, so I thought we just added these slides in here a moment ago. So I'm adjusting on the fly here, and I promise I'll keep it to 12 minutes. This was Jefferson's birthday. I'd just been up there to see Jason Rezaian, the Washington Post correspondent who had suffered terribly in prison in Iran under the most bizarre set of charges. He was one of my favorite correspondents from Iran, doing essentially many of the same things that I've been doing, trying to help both countries understand each other and find bridges between the 2 countries. And to the radicals over there, that was not real popular. He was in prison terribly for it. When he was in prison in Iran, as he revealed to his audience at Monticello back on Jefferson's birthday, his wife, who had been released previously, she managed to get him some books. And he's reading a book, I kid you not, on Jefferson and religious freedom from Evan prison. So there's a book idea for you called Meeting Jefferson in Tehran. It go to low bestseller list, not the same thing as Lolita, but it was a marvelous talk. It was also very moving, and he did suffer terribly, and one of my great people that I admire. Now, on the way back, as I often do, I stop and visit with Mr. Jefferson's statue at the bottom of the Monticello, and I was explaining to him that I'm finally getting back to finishing a thesis I started a long time ago, built around Jefferson's first sentence in the Declaration of Independence: a decent respect to the opinions of mankind, because that's what this conference is about. Tunisians, people in the Arab world, are saying, what do we need to do to get the United States to pay attention to our struggles with freedom? Well, it's you have a decent respect to the opinions of mankind, particularly the opinions of humankind here in the United States. And that's a struggle that Jefferson would very much recognize. Mr. Jefferson wasn't really impressed. He was excited that I was bringing it to a conclusion. He didn't say anything. But then it was kind of, you see the glum look on his face. But then we moved on to the subject where I was really interested to discover that when he and John Adams, Jefferson was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. John Adams, secondary author. They had great correspondence even after years of political rivalry, which is an interesting model there for one reason in Arab Spring. But Jefferson and Adams had a magnificent correspondence, which did include lots of discussions in the last 15 years of their lives about revolutions that they witnessed around the world. I have a few things to say about that in a moment. Anyway, I told Jefferson the story that Mr. Adams, when he died, they both died on the same day, 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Kidding not, I'm making that up. It actually happened. They both consciously waited for the 4th, 1826. Jefferson actually died first. Adams didn't know that. Adams died, the wording goes, and it's apparently from a fairly reliable source, his last comments were Jefferson still survives. And when Jefferson heard that, he laughed. He said, aha, see, he was working again. So, but then I got to tell him, I'm using that metaphor as a way that I'm planning on doing a book. I'm planning on doing a book on Jefferson and Revolution, and then Jefferson and Revolution now. And in all my teachings of the Arab Spring, and I'll talk about this in a moment, I spent a lot of time talking about Jeffersonian observations on where these revolutions came from, where they were going, what problems that they had. But then I saw him, I said, it's been really discouraging lately. I haven't taught the course since 2017. We had COVID, a series of other things. The revolutions had petered out. And then I told him about my great despair over what's happened in Tunisia just in the past 2 years, in the past few months. And that was hard to take. And I thoroughly depressed myself. And then I heard a whispered voice speak in my ear, Tunisia still survives. And that was, that was my turn to laugh. And then it was my turn to cry. Because I'm aware of Jefferson's words and observations on that. And let's dig into that a little bit. First of all, before I get in, what I'm going to be doing is I'll give a series of observations. I could spend a lot of time talking about Tunisia, but let's do the Jefferson person. That's the thing we should bring to the conference here. And I'm grateful to be here. So many of the I've been following the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy's work since its founding. I've used your materials from so many of your publications. Aziz Tajidina, your founding chair board, was actually a great help to me when I did the book on Iran. His work on how to help me understand Islam and human rights, understanding the struggles within Islam inside Iran was magnificent. I also learned a lot about his former classmate, somebody named Khamenei, great person to work with. Another leading light from Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy, one of your board members, Akbar Ahmad. I chanced to see his 2010 film documentary, A Journey into America, where he took students around America, including a stop at my university, the University of Virginia, and he had them looking up at the Jefferson statue, and I'm going to show it to you right here. This is the Jefferson statue that he had them looking up at. Statue that I had walked by every day for decades. And he had the students looking up at it, and they saw the names of God on that. Well, this is just one of the themes that's on the side of that statue. And as you can see, I think you can make that out there. It says religious freedom, 1786, and then the names of God in different faiths: God, Jehovah, Brahma, Atman, Ra, Allah, Zeus. And Professor Ahmad didn't quite have the story right, as to he didn't know anything about the sculptor who did that. Anyway, I was dumbfounded when I saw that. And I started asking everybody I knew, I asked Professor Ramzani, Larry Savage, I said, why the names of God on the side of the Jefferson statue? And that's one of those things where another reason why I'm grateful for the Center for Scholars associated with this. And he brought that to my attention. And then I've done a series of articles on this sculptor, Moses Ezekiel, and his work as a Jewish sculptor. And for many Jewish people in America, that statement of religious freedom was one of the key reasons. Jefferson, when he died, wanted to be remembered for three great contributions: not being president, not being Secretary of State, but for authoring that Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom, or yes, authoring the American Declaration of Independence, and then thirdly, founding the University of Virginia. For him, for the struggle for democracy to survive, you had to have an educated citizenry, and that was what all three of these things went together. I don't really have time to talk about this, but I had also had the misfortune to be around UVA during some of its darkest moments. Some of you may remember what this is all about. Again, that statue, which had the names of God on the side of it, celebrating among the themes on that statue, religious freedom. You had the neo-Nazis. I had just finished teaching one of my Arab Spring courses in the summer. I had a group of 20 students, including 12 of them from China. Talk about an amazing course, teaching course on the Arab Spring to course kids from China who can't even talk to each other because they're a bit afraid of each other. It was an amazing experience. But the day after that course ended, this happened. You had the neo-Nazis marching on UVA, and as they came, they were aiming at the Jefferson statue. That's where they went to. And they were screaming, "Jews will not replace us. You will not replace us," having no idea that the man who did the sculpture was a Jewish young man. That led to this incredible confrontation at base, which I was there that night. There's a group of 10 students, there wasn't many students around then, group of students, something later called Black Lives Matter, something like that. And they were extremely exposed and in danger. There was one university administrator there who got speared coming to their aid. Thankfully, it didn't break out into violence, but that was an extremely dangerous thing. Think about the that's happening underneath the Jefferson statue. Again, don't have more time to go into this, but one of the things that happened just a few days later, that same student group, in their trauma, and they suffered, and some of the girls were really hurt, broken bones, concussions. They put together a list of demands And their first demand was, the original draft was to tear the statue down. They too had an idea of what was on that statue. What was interesting is that one of my students from a previous semester, a young lady from Jordan, very young lady, thank you, she put together the observation that, before we tear it down, maybe we want to study what's on it. And I know I went off in this direction instead of the other direction that I was going to go to. I can tell you, at least as a broad outline, I'm doing a book on the subject, but there's a series of what's interesting about Jefferson. Love him or leave him, for all his faults, he, in many ways, in that Declaration of Independence, set forth a series of ideals, a statement of who we aspire to be, not necessarily who we were, but those we're still wrestling and still struggling with that. There's so many, like I said, Jefferson observed revolutions for the next 50 years of his life. He was exhilarated, he was thrilled. I think he was thrilled by the Arab Spring of Tunisia, the great achievements that they were able to do without so much violence. But this very same Jefferson, and I can give you lots of quotes, and maybe I'll do it on article for you. Jefferson importance, the excitement that I used in my class about the Arab Spring, but the same Jefferson was also quite aware of revolutions having gone bad. He was a great supporter of the French Revolution, so much so that he helped Marquis de Lafayette write for the French Declaration on the Rights of Man. But on the other hand, he saw it go so badly, and he was perhaps a bit too determined in wanting to look the other way despite all the rivers of blood. Jefferson was also quite skeptical about revolution he saw happen all across Latin America. Thank you. And he was, you can see all of these comments of his optimism and at the same time his concern for revolution. All I'm saying is from the perspective of we as Americans, we were a nation, Americans, I think, forget that we were founded as a revolutionary country. Watch the fawning coverage of British royalty thing in Britain and what's going on here. Yeah, we were founded as a revolutionary country. It's something Americans should care about, but at the same time, the very same man who wrote our founding revolutionary document in his life, in his observations, was also a guide to helping us understand why these revolutions still have great struggles. And I know you're all very tired, and thank you for bearing with me. So I'd be happy to take more questions or invite me to come talk to your places. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know we're really over time because we started this panel late. If there are any questions, we'll take them right now. Otherwise, we'll move right into the next panel. Not all at once. Okay, great. So thank you so much. We're going to transition to the next panel. We'll have about a 5-minute break if you want to grab some coffee. But thank you, everyone.
Awesome. چیکارش کردیم خیلی ساز ببین الان ما اینجا صدای نوشته الان اینجا نگاه کن فکر میکنی ارواح دارن حرف میشن
میدونم من چیکار کنم که کامera رو ریست بکنم برام بگیرم چجوری اصلا ریستش بکنم
ساسمین این صدا
خیلی ساده
من بشم چیز کنم فهمیش دوتر برای چپتر میکنه این آدم رشته پوزیده و چه 5-11 و کافیه
این
نه ساعت نیست باید تایمر یا بدرس ولی اون وقتا که چپتر بکردیم مثلا بهش بودیم 5 دقیقه یه با چسته کن میگو 6 تا 5 دقیقه ستش یه مثل کیست ها
I will roll up some building. Oh, sorry, microphone was toying. The title of this panel is The Role of Islamic Values in Building a Just Society and Political System. As you can see, we have 5 speakers scheduled to speak this afternoon. They have been told that they have exactly 12 minutes, 10 to 12 minutes. We're hoping that there will be time for a Q&A at the end. So without further ado, I would really like to get us started. Our first speaker is Mark Tetzler, who is Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan, who will be speaking on what does Islam really say about the rights, status, and behavior of women, the interpretations of Islam embraced by ordinary Muslim citizens in the Arab world.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here and I appreciate the invitation. You told me to stick to my 12 minutes and I want someone to pull me away if I'm not done. This is part of a larger project on measurement. I'm using surveys to measure certain kinds of attitudes relating to Islam. The red items on my top of some examples are things I'm not going to talk about here because they're part of the larger project. What I am going to talk about is attitudes and values and perceptions and interpretations related to women. So as you know, there are a lot of different points of view, and if people want to know, well, what does Islam really say? Either there is no answer, or it depends on who you ask. So here's a broad spectrum. I think it was Andrew who mentioned Said Qutb and Al-Dudi. And now we put in Sheikh Rashid, put in perhaps Hassan Turabi. But there's the spectrum of views, ranging from pretty restrictive to a fairly radical interpretation. I don't want to say reinterpretation, because they would say this is the correct interpretation of Islam on questions related to women. I'm using Arab Barometer data, and thanks to Amani's presentation, I don't have to say much about it. If we do have time for comments and questions, I'll be happy to try to answer some questions about it. Just a few things about the barometer. Here's this constellation of surveys that we've done. Amani talked about it a bit. You may notice there's some holes in metrics here, and that's because our very serious quality control procedures indicated that some of the data were problematic and reluctantly we threw them out. But the data are essentially very quality, they're readily available. I encourage you to download them and use them. And if by chance you don't have the time or the interest in the software to download them, the online analysis tool in both Arabic and English is fascinating. I encourage you to take a look if you're at all interested in what people think. You can pick a particular country, you can pick a particular year, you can select a particular question, and see what the answer was. And if you want to know whether men and women answer that question the same way, the online analysis tool will tell you that. Okay, so what are we doing with respect to trying to gauge people's attitudes towards Islamic interpretation? There's a battery of questions, only two of which are on here. It begins with this statement, question 703. Today, as in the past, Muslim scholars and jurists sometimes disagree about the proper definition of Islam in response to present-day issues. We asked about a lot of issues, not just women, banks charging interest, non-Muslim minorities, Islam and democracy. So there's a whole series of questions on this. And I picked out two that have to do with the circumstances of women. These are good questions. There's some reason we could have picked some different ones, but these turned out to be pretty interesting. And they're things that were more or less current. And this is through the first four waves through 2016. I'm analyzing the more recent data, but they're not here yet. And we asked people, is it a violation of Islam in this class? They ought to be set. Is it the case that Islam requires, expects a woman to dress modestly, but does not require hijab? Here are the responses to these two individual questions, and we've added them together to make an index, and that's what's at the bottom. And as you can see, one, there's a fairly diverse set of opinions. People have relatively diverse views about the answer to these questions. But there is a skew, there is a tendency that predominates, and that is more people tend to take, for lack of a better word, I'm calling them liberal interpretations. Perhaps not quite the right term, but it's more conceptualized, it's less orthodox and restricted. But there are people at the other end of the scale as well. So taking this battery of countries and years together, we get an overall picture of how people see Islam has a and you said you could read the individual numbers here. 17.6% disagree that a woman has to wear a headscarf, for example. Okay, I've looked at these and I'm going to show you just some descriptives about what the distributions look like across this continuum that you see here in different countries and in different years. I'm going to go through it very quickly. The average of the midpoint of this scale over here at the bottom is 5.5. And we see that wave one is 2006, 2007. Wave two is 2010, 2011. Wave three is 2013, and wave four is 2016. So just taking Jordan, I'm not going to read you all the figures that are up here, but just taking Jordan, in 2006 and 2007, that can be 2006 in the Jordanian case, The midpoint was 5.5, and their average score was 4.7. So it's not that far away from the midpoint, but it is a reasonable distance toward the liberal side of the continuum. Women said, respondents, both men and women, saying, no, Islam does not require the hijab. Yes, modesty, but it's not a requirement of the hijab. And no, men and women like studying together in the same class. That's not a violation of Islam. So there's a tendency in that direction. You can see for all of it, let's say something about Tunisia separately in just a second, that first Algeria and Jordan are about the same as is Egypt. The reason we don't have for wave one either Egypt or Tunisia, you could probably imagine we couldn't do this under Mubarak and we couldn't do this under Ben Ali. So we didn't begin our surveys in those countries until after the Arab Spring. So far, we continue to be able to do it. We'll see if that remains the case as we go forward. So for Jordan, Algeria, and Egypt, for what we have, the patterns are pretty much the same, not very far from the midpoint, but somewhat in the more progressive or liberal direction. Standard deviation, which is variance around the mean, to what extent is there agreement? Might be the case for 4.7 represents a whole bunch of people who said 7s and 8s, very conservative, and a whole bunch of people who said 2 and 3, very liberal. And the mean is kind of just an arbitrary midpoint. But that's not the case here. Small standard deviations mean that there's a lot of coming together around the mean. Basically, 70% of the respondents would be between 4.7 plus 1.4 or 4.7 minus 1.4. So we see the pattern is pretty similar, not too far off, not a lot of variation, and strikingly, very little change from year to year. Over the period from 2006 to 2016, this decade, all the things that took place during that period, the distributions, both with respect to central tendency and with respect to dispersion or variance or standard deviation, are about the same. Tunisia is the one country that stands out in ways that probably don't surprise us very much if we know Tunisia. Tunisia is much more consistently toward the liberal end, answering these questions in a way that suggests, no, Islam does not require separation of men and women in class. No, Islam does not insist upon women wearing the hijab. Tunisia is much more liberal in that sense. There's even less variance around the mean, but there is more and more agreement among the spectrum of Tunisians that those responses are the correct responses. And over time, 2000, wave 2, 3, and 4, every time the Tunisian central tendency becomes more toward the liberal side. You'll have to help me find a better word than liberal to describe that. Finally, I want to show you a little bit about some of the predictors. And I underline predictors. I'm not trying to do, for those of you who are interested in stats, I'm not trying to do causal inference. I think that requires some interesting analysis that I hope to do, but it's more than what is done right here. It's simply what personal attributes predict to be higher or lower on scale. Higher being the scale ranges 2 to 8, and higher being 8 or conservative. In Algeria, and I'll stop when we get to 11 to 12 minutes so that I won't go over as far as I can. In Algeria, it's interesting, every one of these variables, sex or gender, age, education, and religiosity or level of personal religiosity, every one of those variables is a good predictor of where a person is going to be on the scale. And the sign on the beta or the coefficient, either a minus sign or not a minus sign, indicates the direction. So with respect to gender, female being a woman predicts to being low. That's what the minus sign 0.296 represents. Predicts to being low on this scale, meaning further away from the conservative pole of 8. On older age predicts to being more conservative. That's why it's an increase in age predicts to an increase on the scale, and the scale increases toward 8, the most conservative position. More education predicts to lower levels or more liberal to positions on the scale, and being less religious predicts to being more liberal on the scale or less conservative. Every country is different, and that's really something for me to spend some time on another occasion trying to sort out. It's not the case in any other country that all four of these are accurate predictors. I'm not alleged to claim that they're causal agents, but they're good predictors. In Egypt, you can see in Egypt, being a woman predicts to being more toward the liberal side. Sorry, I said that wrong. The significance levels over here, it ought to be less than 0.05 for it to be statistically significant. If there's time and interest, we can have a little bit of a conversation about that. But for sex and for religiosity, the coefficients are these turn out not to be predictors. It's kind of surprising that in 2 minutes, sounds good. It's kind of surprising that in Egypt, women and men don't really differ that much in terms of the way they're answering these questions. Unlike Algeria, where it did make a big difference. What does make a difference is age and education. And in exactly the same way as we saw before, older age predicts to be more liberal. More education predicts to be more liberal. I don't really know if it's necessarily all that useful to go through and summarize each one of the others. What you can see here is a picture of what personal attributes are good predictors of the way a person is going to answer these two questions that I put together in a scale. And we can see that there are interesting country differences. The demographic attributes to predict to a statistically significant degree in each of the countries is different. And there's some room for some good analysis. In poli-sci, we call these scope conditions. What is it about Tunisia that explains why women answer the questions the way they do, when in another country, say Egypt, being a woman doesn't matter? What are the conditions that define or specify when a particular predictor is going to be effective or not? So I'm going to kind of leave it there. Dependent variable is how people think about, how people's views about what Islam really says, what assessments they attach to Islam in terms of interpretations, how that varies from country to country and over time across the four waves. And then for each of the four countries highlighting here, the analysis is actually based on more which demographic attributes are good predictors, and why is that the case? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. You actually set a very good example for us in terms of time, which everyone is definitely going to follow. Our second speaker is Mustafa Akyol. He's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute here in DC. And his presentation is on how Islamic values can contribute to building a free society.
Thank you so much, Asma. Thanks to the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy for organizing this event and kindly inviting me as well. It's a difficult time in most of the homelands that we come from, and because it's not the best time for freedom and democracy in the Muslim world, especially the Middle East. That's not my slide, but kill it. But that's precisely why I think we should keep the good fight. And I really congratulate my friends at the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy for precisely doing that. Now, how Islamic values can contribute to building a free society. I mean, one can write volumes on this, but I'll just share a few thoughts in the 10 minutes that I have. First, let me remind that religions can vary widely in their interpretations in relation to human freedom. We've seen that in the history of Christianity. interpretations of Christianity have varied from the Spanish Inquisition, which tortured heretics and persecuted Jews, to the civil rights movement in the United States, led by Martin Luther King, which with Christian inspiration and with other religious inspirations too, but for Martin Luther King, for many others, they defended rights, equal rights against the racist bias in this country. And I think that diversity exists in other religions as well, and I think in Islam too. But it's good to recall how Christianity changed in that sense. There was a time, actually, for more than 1,000 years, Christianity was a very oppressive religion, and Jews know this well, because they repeatedly escaped from Christendom to the lands of Islam, which was fear at the time. Because there was the idea that the heretics and sinners should be punished and brought to discipline. There was also idea of divine rights of kings, that the kings are given the rights by God to rule. All those ideas changed gradually with a new interpretation of Christianity, which goes back to the origins of liberalism. By liberalism, I don't mean the central left ideology in the States today, but classical, original liberalism, represented by thinkers like John Locke. And what John Locke did was basically offer a new interpretation of Christianity, where there were no divine rights of kings, but there were rights of men to live freely and have a contractual relationship with others. Also, he brought the idea that states should not uphold one version of Christianity. Right. Flourishing society, and everything was too more. It took more time for the Catholic Church to accept those ideas. Now, I believe in Islam we are seeing a similar transition as well. What I can call Islamic liberalism is in the making. Some people think, wow, Islam actually didn't need that. Well, comparatively speaking, actually, until a few years ago, it's true that the Islamic world was the freest part of the world. That's why people escaped from Islam. Now it's the other way around for we know. Also, the past 2 centuries, certain intellectuals, certain Islamic scholars realized that we need to embrace more freedom. We need to reinterpret certain things in our tradition because they realized that that was the main problem in Islam. These thinkers are 19th century figures that, the Ottoman Empire, not was the most figure among them. They realized that the constitutional government that secures rights, limits the ruler, and advances economic and political liberalism is good, and it's even compatible with Islam, with a new approach to the Sharia. So they articulated this, and actually they led to important reforms in the late Ottoman Empire. Another thinker that really contributed to this discussion was from Tunisia, Hayat al-Tunusi. Tunisia is a small country, but gave a lot of great good minds that helped the Ummah still going on as today. He has this, famous book, The Surest Path to Aqwam al-Masalik. The surest path to development, he says, is freedom, economic freedom, political freedom, freedom of the press, and a government limited by rule of law. Those ideas actually led some important reforms in the 19th century, but in the 20th century, we Muslims lost that edge a little bit, to a big extent actually, for a few reasons. Because of Western colonialism, which created reactionary attitudes in Islamic circles, and also secular dictatorships were established in the Muslim world, which didn't need this Islamic liberalism. They needed neither Islam nor liberalism. They just wanted to have this one-party state, right, and imposing what they understand as modernity. But with all the bitter conflicts between, I think, to take a point in the history of Islamic civilization, that still need to take ideas like this. And that we have a discussion about what the core issues when we speak about Islam and freedom, and Islam and politics. That is the meaning of the Sharia, Islamic law. That's why, I mean, I have a book, Why as a Muslim I Defend Liberty. I discusses the two faces of the Sharia, or the two aspects of the Sharia that we have to deal with, because I think there are prospects and challenges when we look at into the history of Islamic law and Islamic legal tradition. Well, the challenges are not unknown to us. I mean, the challenges that we see in the interpretations of Sharia that has come to us today, that's fiqh, actually, jurisprudence built in medieval times, is that there is a certain dose of religious coercion. Taliban does that in very crude terms, but we see the examples of that in Saudi Arabia. We see that in examples of that in Iran, and certain Islamist movements, and that term is, yes, complicated, also aspire for an application of the Sharia, and even if they are not there, the fact that they have this coercive idea creates an endless resentment and tension in Muslim regional societies. What are these issues? Well, coercion, apostasy laws, blasphemy laws, the idea of hisba, religion police, that police forces will go there and check women are wearing hijab or not, or whether people are drinking alcohol. The idea of bringing a moral society through coercion, that is a major issue which has to be addressed. And it is. I mean, there are Islamic scholars, intellectuals speaking. I mean, there are a lot of books published over the years about why actually the Quran doesn't punish apostasy, or blasphemy laws. Actually, they're referred to what Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did, but actually it was not about blasphemy, it was about treason to the state. So all these discussions are out there, but these important issues have to be figured out. And I think a clearer version, understanding of Sharia needs to be put out. On the other hand, there is a strong basis in the Sharia for freedom, for liberalism. People are surprised when I say that. There is, because there was something really important about Sharia which actually did wonders in the classical civilization. Sharia was a law that did not come from the ruler. It came from a source that is above the ruler. Actually, it was a higher authority. And actually, people could hold the ruler responsible and constrain the ruler thanks to the Sharia. Because let's not forget, I mean, in classical Islamic civilization, law did not come from the dictates of the Sultan or the king himself. There were different periods, but ultimately what consolidated was that law came from God and from the texts of the Quran and Sunnah, and the scholars interpreted that, and those scholars were not mouthpieces of the Sultan. They at times became, and that was a major problem, it still continues to be a problem in certain parts of the world. But the idea that the law is separate from the ruler, and it had really important implementations or results. For example, in the Ottoman Empire, we have stories, we have episodes of a sultan willing to punish some people out of just his caprice, and the Shaykhul Islam stops the sultan from doing that. You cannot do this. This is against Sharia. We know that Islamic scholars, for example, stopped over-taxation of the population by references to the Sharia. By reference to the Sharia, for example, out of the Sultan, Yavuz Sultan Selim the Grim, who was a heavy-handed sultan, considered converting Christians in the Balkans to Islam forcibly because it would be good for the state. But his Shaykhul Islam said, you cannot do this, this is against the law, and he was actually stopped by that. So, in other words, the Sharia actually upheld a value that became a fundamental value in political liberalism in the modern era, which is called separation of powers. Montesquieu is historically respected for systematizing this idea that the law and the executive power, they should be separate. And we actually had that in this. And unfortunately, in the modernization of the Islamic world, Islamic movements kept on believing in the coercive aspects of the Sharia, but that fundamental spirit of the law being separate from the rulers and about the rulers, the Muslim world lost that to a great extent. All the modern Leviathans we established in the modern era, from Turkish Republic to Arab republics, they basically turned into autocratic states where the dictates of the ruler became the law. And we still are living the consequences of that. Now, there are, as I said, 19th century Islamic thinkers who ponder these issues. There are also contemporary thinkers who ponder issues and has written important works and inspired important moves. And of course, I think the most important of them today is Sheikh Rashid Al-Nushi, who's in a Tunisian jail now because of a petty dictator who did judiciary against him to put him in jail on bogus charges. Rashid Al-Nushi's, I think, emphases on freedom, as Dr. Marsh just actually mentioned in the previous panel, are really important and I think fundamental. I just would like to highlight two aspects of his thought, which speak to the issues of the Sharia that I'm speaking about. One is that Sheikh Al-Nushi realized this historical function of the Sharia as something that constrains rulers and keeps them in check. In a speech in 2013, a lecture titled Meanings and Rationales of the Post-Revolutionary Constitution, he even said the Islamic Sharia only came for the purpose of limiting the authority of the ruler and subjecting him to the law. Now, that's a very grand claim. To say that it only came for that's actually maybe a little hyperbole, but he was emphasizing how it is important that the rulers are not acting out of their whim, and that was the main function that we had law in Islam, and we have to revive that idea. Dr. Ghannouchi also spoke about freedom, the importance of freedom, and he actually went against these idea of punishing blasphemous ideas or banning the books of people who are secular or atheists or other religions and so forth. His book, Public Freedoms in the Islamic State, includes very important insights. One of them is a quote that I got in my own book, Reopening Muslim Minds. And here he discusses what should Muslims do when there is an un-Islamic talk. When somebody writes a book that is atheistic, or somebody propagates Christianity, or some view that you don't like, what do you do about that? Should we not ban Muslims would call for that? Rashid Ghannouchi says, if it is the Muslim's right, even his duty, to call his non-Muslim compatriot to Islam, it is also the land's right to do the same on behalf of his faith. If Muslims fear for the fate of their fellow Muslims, there is no way to remedy this except for Muslims to deepen their own faith or to submit their doubts and question to their scholars. The antithetical viewpoints will reach Muslims by any means, and the only means of protection against any discussion is to offer another discussion, this one better, more intelligent, and more cogent. In other words, I mean, he defends the classical libertarian view of free speech. People have bad ideas, have better ideas and counter them with ideas and not by coercion. I think this is the direction that Islamic thought needs to go and will ultimately go. And despite the turbulences in Tunisia, I think that country still has the democratic, Islamic, liberal potential to go forward. My country, Turkey, has taken a few bad turns, but I want to be optimistic about its future as well. And I think it's a lesson Turkey-wise that shows us that democracy is important, but just about balance, about rule of law. It's about freedom of speech. It's about justice, which are actually the core values of Islam. And we have the roots of those, but we just have to reinterpret them as Hayrettin al-Tunusi did, as Dawud Kemal did, and Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi has made them play. Thank you so much.
Donna. I'm not as technologically savvy as you are, so get your.
I sympathize with sort of.
No, I think- Just- Our third speaker is Yusuf Shahood. He's an assistant professor of political science at Christopher Newport University, and he's speaking on the topic of inheritance laws and the limits of and prospects for gender equality in the MENA region.
All right. Excellent. So this mic is working. I just want to make sure that I have some leeway. I'm Arab and I was based in Brooklyn, so I'm very Canadian. So it doesn't take too long. You're talking to an average layperson about the Middle East. It's kind of like Godwin's law, but a variation of it. At a certain point, some discussion of authoritarianism or women's rights approaches, probability of one, right? So instead of, kind of paying attention to what every Tom, Dick, and Ahmed says about, democracy in the Middle East, let's see what, some scholars have said. So in terms of gender inequality and whether it impedes democracy, one of the kind of foremost studies, or first study, I should say, was done by Steve Fish, where he's actually one of the first people to kind of empirically test this kind of Islam authoritarianism connection. He found the connection, and he said that gender inequality, right? That's the causal pattern. Engelhardt and Norris, and he used kind of these objective kind of socioeconomic indicators. Engelhardt and Norris, more or less come to the same conclusion, but they're looking at kind of inegalitarian attitudes. They're looking at, the attitudes of the average person, in these countries, and how that leads to kind of, a throttling of democracy, if you will. Now, these studies kind of had some pushback, more or less as soon as they came out. Donald and Russett, for example, kind of refined these objective indicators, more robustly kind of model what it is that they're trying to capture, and they kind of push back against Fish's findings. And Fish actually ultimately kind of recants in terms of really leaning into gender inequality being the causal issue. And our own Dr. Amanda Jamel with her colleague also kind of reassessed the survey data, kind of linking gender inequality and democracy, and they similarly, don't find that that there's a link there to actual real contributors to democracy. What about the other way around? Can democracy actually augment gender equality? Well, here too, there's been some kind of mixed empirical findings. But perhaps more interesting are the mixed kind of theoretical findings. On the one hand, intuitively, we imagine gender equality to be a core liberal democratic norm. One which, as with many liberal democratic norms, as the rough and tumble of democratic politics ensues, gets more instantiated in society. However, in the media context, as Dr. Jamel, as my own kind of mentor, Dr. Lloyd, and many others have noted, authoritarian often instrumentalize women's rights. So authoritarian support for egalitarian policies, are seen as kind of in the face of more inegalitarian public opinion. So all this is not necessarily to say that, we shouldn't kind of care about the link between gender equality and democracy. We should care about it in its own right. However, kind of leaning in on this latter point here about the minute context. My colleague and I, we really want to kind of interject and kind of get at some kind of causal claims with regards to gender equality in the MENA region. And so we looked at Tunisia as a site for research. And as many scholars have noted, Tunisia has this kind of legacy of really instantiating women's rights more so than any other country in the region. This begins under Habib Bourguiba. This continues under Zainuddin bin Ali. And in fact, on the eve of the Arab uprisings in 2010, when Freedom House kind of published a comprehensive analysis of women's rights across the region, Tunisia was far and away the country that kind of led the pack in that regard. But that's certainly not to say that after the uprising, there wasn't further advancement. Indeed, we can see the advancement of women's rights in a number of arenas during this period of democratic, this kind of nation democracy, right, in Tunisia. Yet during the time of Bourguiba, during the time of Ben Ali, right, during this authoritarian era, as well as during this kind of era of the democratic opening in Tunisia, there was one issue, right? One issue in which, they really couldn't get much traction on. And that was the issue of inheritance law. In fact, for all of his clout, for all of his, kind of desire to bring about a systemic change to Tunisia, Habib Bourguiba just simply didn't really want to kind of engage in moving forward with changing inheritance law. This is a technical term, right? And so it was left to his self-styled ideological heir, basically the Sipsi, to kind of take up this issue. And so in 2017, he initially kind of nodded to the fact that he wanted to equalize inheritance. And in 2018, he went ahead and actually put forward a bill that would, kind of, in effect, do that. There was some support, obviously. There was certain pockets of support for this, but there was also some concerted pushback at the mass level as well as the elite level. From religious elites, yes, but also from political elites. Not surprisingly, much of the pushback from the political elite end came from Ennahda. And this is, this is notable because Ennahda actually was, very supportive of many of the reforms that took place, since the Arab uprising. But, on a couple of issues, inheritance law being one of them, they really kind of quite firm in their opposition. So why is that? Put differently, what makes inheritance law distinctive? If you look in the Quran, it really doesn't take you too long to come to the conclusion that the distinction is in the excruciating detail, right? With which the kind of Quran kind of goes to the issue of inheritance law. For example, Allah commands you regarding your children, the share of the male will be twice that of female. You only have 2 or more females, their share is 2/3 of the estate, so on and so forth. This is one ayah. Go on to the next ayah. Again, if you have children and your wife will receive 1/8 of the estate after the fulfillment of the requested right. So this is a really great detail, and it's really rare to have this kind of level of detail in the Quran. Put differently, there really isn't any wiggle room when it comes to the issue of inheritance. Right, so many individuals kind of spoke today about the prospects for compromise, the prospects for evolution. On this issue, it's really hard to kind of come to a space where there is compromise. It really is something of an either or. It really is something close to a zero-sum rendering. You either, pay heed to the strictures, or you don't. And so we argue that this comparatively unambiguous that leaves no room for compromise, leads to a couple First, that egalitarian attitudes, that is, attitudes in support of gender equality, will actually be depressed when inheritance is invoked. But we also expect that this negative effect will be kind of most observable among those who kind of support public religiosity, put, kind of crudely, that support Sharia in the public square. So how did we go ahead and test this? We ran a nationally representative face-to-face poll of 900 Tunisians. We actually used the same firm as the Arab Barometer. And we did this during a time when there were no kind of noteworthy shocks. It was actually one of these rare periods during the post-uprising context in Tunisia when it was just, regular politics, right? It wasn't anything kind of existential, kind of top of mind. And so we asked direct questions as well as survey experiments. So let me show you the results from the direct questions first. So we asked whether a married woman can work outside the home, whether a university education for men is more important than women. On both of these questions, we find overwhelming egalitarian support. And these questions are also asked on a number of other surveys, among them the Arab Barometer as well, with very similar kind of outcomes. Where we do find a bit more kind of parity is on this question of, do men make better political leaders than women? I'll get to that in a second. But for our purposes, the most important thing is when it comes to issues of equal inheritance, there is overwhelming disagreement, overwhelming inegalitarianism on that specific issue. So let me step back for a moment and just talk about this political leadership thing. It does seem like, there's something not just in Tunisia, but across the globe when it comes to issues of women taking political leadership roles. We see this in a number of even established democracies. With regard to the equal inheritance bit, we see that, it's similar for both men and women. Right? It isn't kind of a function of gender, whether you go for it or not. So that's a descriptive analysis. Let's turn to the experiment. So we asked a certain portion of our respondents whether they support the following statement: the state should provide equal political, economic, and social rights for men and women on a scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree, so a 5-point scale. We had a bureaucratic treatment. So to see, is it just simply a matter of kind of deference to tradition? So we asked, according to Tunisian civil code, men receive double the inheritance of women, and then we gave them kind of the same text up here thereafter, asking them, do they support equal treatment of women and men? And then lastly, we had the Quranic treatment. According to Surah An-Nisa, men receive double the inheritance of women. Again, and then asking them, do you support the state kind of equalizing the treatment of men and women? So what did we find? Well, we found that those who got the control were significantly higher, significantly more egalitarian than those who were primed to consider the issue of inheritance. And, somewhat surprisingly, we found that there was no difference between the bureaucratic and the Quranic treatment, meaning that this is really kind of baked into this issue, right? The kind of nod to Sharia is really kind of baked into this issue. It's not simply a matter of kind of tradition. So whereas the control you see kind of very comfortably in the egalitarian range, now you're plausibly in the inegalitarian range when you invoke inheritance law. So we said, let's kind of probe this linkage to support for Sharia a bit more. Because I'm kind of a little short on time, I'll just kind of note that we had this index, an index that had some pretty decent kind of variation that allowed us to test, whether religiosity, public religiosity really was doing any work to kind of move the needle on this. And what we find is that similarly, as you become more in support of public religiosity, whether you got the bureaucratic treatment or you got the Quranic treatment, you become significantly less egalitarian in your view of equal rights between women and men. And here's the kicker, right? So thus far I've shown you kind of the limits of gender equality. But remember, in the descriptive data, we showed that there were these very egalitarian attitudes. Here too, we can see that there's a very egalitarian consistency, right, across support for Sharia amongst the control. So those who are at the highest level of Sharia support are just as likely statistically as those at the lowest level of Sharia support, right, to kind of express egalitarian attitudes, right? It's only when you start invoking this issue of inheritance law that that gets pulled down. So to conclude, some findings and implications. We argue that inheritance law falls outside this kind of traditional matrix of gender equality. And this has some empirical and kind of theoretical implications. Empirically, for those who are kind of trying to code levels of gender equality, I think it behooves them to not simply uncritically include a measure of support for inheritance law in that coding. It could lead you to kind of disregard an otherwise much higher level of gender equality that exists in that context. Theoretically, too, perhaps we can start, thinking about how policies like this form the content of, concepts like Islamic or Muslim democracy. And then lastly, we saw that the invocation of inheritance reform really hampers otherwise more egalitarian attitudes towards women's rights. And so this has very clear kind of implications, right? So there is this kind of space of an overlapping consensus. But once you kind of populate that space with this content of inheritance law, that space becomes much more constrained. So that's really important for foreign policy actors, whether they be kind of states or whether they be kind of NGOs. Human Rights Watch, for example, was very critical of ENACTA for doing what they thought was kind of a 180, supporting a lot of women's rights reform, but then standing firm against inheritance law. On balance, our research shows that that might be kind of negative in the long-term net, but also this is really important for domestic policymakers to kind of keep this in mind whenever politics in Tunisia goes back to being regular schmegular, whenever that is, there is the next democratic opening in Tunisia, inshallah. Thank you for your
Thank you, Yusuf. Our fourth speaker is Lindsay Benstead. She's the director of the Middle East Studies Center at Portland State University, and she's speaking on the topic of what explains voter preference in Tunisia's transitional election. For some reason, we have a preponderance of interest in Tunisia. It's big. Yes, I'll just. Yeah. Sir.
you, Redwan, for the invitation, and thank you to everyone who's contributed today, making the day a success. The title of my presentation is What Explains Voter Preferences in Tunisia's Transitional Elections. This project is one within the context of a broader question that has to do with why do Islamist parties succeed electorally, and how do parties consolidate voter bases in transitional contexts. In terms of thinking about why Islamist parties succeed electorally in some contexts, most of the conventional explanations focus on programmatic appeals. There are both those scholars who believe that religious ideology and appealing to citizens' piety explains votes for Islamist parties, as well as those like Tariq Massoud who have argued that economic programs explain voters' preferences for Islamist parties. Many observers attribute the rising tide of support for Islamic-oriented parties to religious appeals and citizens' piety, while Massoud argues that the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood was successful due to its economic vision, not religious ideology. Yet the role of constituency service and clientelism in explaining support for Islamist parties has not been explored. This is somewhat surprising given the importance of personal linkages in mobilizing voters in semi-competitive elections, as well as in contexts like Tunisia during the 2010 to 2020 period, where the country was transitioning to democracy, but had a recent experience with semi-competitive elections. In this paper, I argue that due to its greater organizational capacity, institutionalization, and cohesiveness, the newly legalized Ennahda party was more successful than other parties in utilizing clientelistic services to mobilize voters between 2011 and 2015. I will show that Ennahda not only provided more constituency service through the parliament than other parties, but that it was more successful than other parties in translating this constituency service into the consolidation of electoral support. The period that I look at in this paper is from 2011 to 2014. The initial constituent assembly elections were held in 2011. Along some colleagues, we conducted a survey in 2012. So we were able to ask respondents which party they voted for in 2011 and which party they intended to vote for in 2014. We know from existing literature that Ennahda had greater organizational capacity than many other parties during this period. As Anne Wolf writes in her book, in a period of less than 6 weeks, Ennahda established more than 2,000 party offices, including 24 bureaus in different governorates. In survey research that I conducted with Ellen Lust and Dr. Malouche, our surveys show that Ennahda was perceived to be more organizationally capable than other parties when we ask citizens to rate the capabilities of different parties. It follows then that given this organizational capacity, Ennahda likely had the ability to interact with constituents and if not being able to always be successful in helping citizens with requests that they would make, would at least be able to be more responsive than other parties in interacting and listening to citizens. So then there are two competing hypotheses in the paper: the ideology hypothesis and the clientelism hypothesis. The first being that religious voters will be more likely to support Ennahda than secular voters. And the second, that citizens who benefit from a constituency service linkage with a member of parliament are more likely to support that same party in the subsequent election than those who have not interacted with a member of parliament. To test these hypotheses, I use a 2012 original survey conducted among 1,200 Tunisians. It was conducted face-to-face. It was using a PPS sample that was nationally representative with random within household selection. There are two dependent variables. The first, which party did the respondent vote for in the 2011 Constituent Assembly elections? And the second, which party, as of 2012, does the respondent believe that they will vote for? The results of the survey were quite similar to the actual election results. You can see this first part of the figure that approximately 40% of the respondents voted for Anata, while 29% voted for other parties and 31% did not vote. Within a year, 14% said that they planned to vote for Anata, 16% said they planned to vote for a different party, and 70% said that they hadn't decided yet which party or whether to vote at all. So I ran multi-variable logistic regressions, and I included a number of independent variables measured at the individual level, including religiosity, preferences regarding political Islam, whether the respondent had contacted a member of the 2011 Constituent Assembly to ask help with a problem that their family had, gender, class, rural residence, education level, age, the gender, and dress style of the interview. The descriptive statistics were very interesting when I looked at all of the instances in which a citizen reported that he or she had, between 2011 and 2012, spoken to a member of the Constituent Assembly about a personal request that he or she had. I found that 5% of Tunisians contacted an MP between 2011 and 2012. However, despite the fact that held 37% of the seats in the assembly, 75% of all requests made to parliamentarians were made to an Ennahda deputy. So this suggested that Ennahda was present in the localities and was more than other parties responsive to citizens regarding the requests that they had. So I ran, again, voter choice, two models of voter choice using multinomial logistic regression and computed predicted probabilities. And I'll just summarize a few brief findings with regard to what the voter basis for Ennahda looked like in 2011 and 1 year later in 2012. In 2011, consistently with, I think, our preconceived ideas, those who voted for Ennahda in 2011 were of lower classes than middle and upper classes. They tended to live in urban areas. They were religiously practicing in that they reported that they regularly prayed, and they tended to hold an Islamist ideology or support for political Islam. However, within 1 year of this initial election, we could see a different voter base starting to crystallize. When asked whether they were excited about how they would vote in the next elections, which ultimately were held in 2014, we can see that within 1 year, there was no impact of religious piety on voter choice. So Ennahda's decided voters were no longer more religious than those who were not, but they tended to be from all different backgrounds in terms of religiosity. They tended also to be those that said that they had not had some kind of a clientelistic linkage under Ben Ali, so they tended to be those that were more marginalized perhaps under the previous regime. However, those who had made a request to an Ennahda deputy were 45% more likely to say that they were a decided voter. Even though initially 2011 and the voters tended to be male, by 2012 they tended to be more often female than male, although the p-value on this on gender was at the 0.10 level of significance. Okay, so in conclusion, I argue that due to its greater organizational capacity, party institutionalization, and cohesiveness, and the Ennahda Party was more successful than other parties in utilizing constituency service to mobilize voters between 2011 and 2014, contributing to the formation of a nascent voter base for its party. Ananda's use of constituency service also helped mobilize some female voters, while in the past, and in the initial period, its voters tended to be more male. This study suggests the importance of organizational capacity and party capacity as an explanation for party success in transitional cases. Thank you for your attention.